Next up then is Karen MacCormack. Find Karen on the list. Right. Karen MacCormack is the author of more than a dozen books of poetry, and her poems have appeared in a number of anthologies. Her work has been translated into French, Portuguese, Swedish and Norwegian. Of dual British and Canadian citizenship, she currently lives in the USA and teaches at the State University of Buffalo. So it's another great player. I'm full of great players today, but I do actually need them. It's a great pleasure to have Karen here, particularly because we have a book launch by Karen later on in the evening, so I'll say more later. For the time being, Karen.
To apologize to Robert Hampson. An earlier version of this, and it's still a work in progress. I went no-tech, and I do have some illustrations. I make reference to things that are easily accessible online. So, enmeshed tessitura, poetry through architecture's thermal response and other musings. This begins with an epigram. I quote a partial sentence as it sounds. Poetry is an art with a technique, with media, and an art which must be in constant flux, a constant change of manner, if it is to live. This paper in progress focuses on the possibilities afforded poetry by recent architectural developments and significant discoveries of contemporary architects, particularly those of New York-based Peter Yang and Martina Decker, and especially in the contexts of ephemerality and permanence, inscriptions and imaging of text. If we think of language as our primary environment, then poetry and what poetry is to language meets architecture in a pivotal contact of potential transport for both. Transport in the sense of being moved to heightened understandings through specific yet unexpected encounters. As the architect Stephen Hall suggests, quote, making a book is like making a building, unquote. While this takes us outside the specific practice of poetry, it points to shared architectonic activities. Just as writing, and prose and poetry, benefited productively from the techniques of collage and cutout imported from visual art early in the 20th century, these same techniques in visual arts, film, and music have evolved in ensuing decades. With the developments in sciences and technologies that are changing our lives daily, the art's position in relation to these developments is in flux as new questions and new ways of questioning the potential interactions emerge. As Stephen Connors writes, quote, for thousands of years we have lived in language, but now we are beginning to take up residence in science. In an earlier essay, in Innovations Inventory, a slightly revised version of Mutual Labyrinth Proposal Exchange, which was published in 2004, my concern was with the enduring influence of visual art and its techniques on poetry, and the potentially vital exchange between poetry and innovative architectural practice. In it, I maintained that if the techniques of collage, erasure, and overlay, when applied to writing, often produce a more severe discomfort or dislocation in the reader than such examples do in viewers of film and/or video works, then it is crucial to recognize that changes in the English language, or versions of the English language, to be precise, continue their impact on a near daily basis. Language isn't static. yet readers frequently appear to take false comfort in the illusion that it provides a terra firma of both grammar and meaning. And just as these techniques in the visual arts and film have evolved, then what is the contemporary productive exchange between poetry and other disciplines? Initially, it seemed to me the architectural projects of Arakawa and Madeline Gims was one probable answer to this question when I began to investigate innovative architectural practice early in 2000. I would later privilege the work of architects Bernard Cash and especially Marcus Novak. At this point, a digression seems appropriate. My experience with innovative architecture has been marred, for the most part, by my attempts to engage with the architects responsible for the work I'm most interested in. The architectural practitioners I've contacted have been pleased by the attention, but with few exceptions, seem too engrossed in their own activities to do more than nod in a passing direction. Of course, it is the work that is of enduring importance, but it seems to me that in order to explore the potential contemporary productive exchanges between poetry and architecture, a poet must do more than simply read architectural writings. My subsequent experience with Peter Yaden and Martina Decker would prove a welcome change, as would Steve McCaffrey's and my collaboration with poet-architect Jacob West. I concur with architect Neil Leach on the danger of the image in architectural practice, as evidenced in magazine and catalog production. This emphasis on the image has certain negative consequences, and it is in a discipline like architecture, which is so directly involved with social concerns, that these negative consequences are likely to be most keenly experienced. Architects, it would seem, are particularly susceptible to an aesthetic that fetishizes the ephemeral image, the surface membrane. The world becomes aestheticized and anesthetized. In the intoxicating world of the image, the aesthetics of architecture threaten to become the anesthetics of architecture. End quote. I also heed Leach's warning that there is a danger in confusing radical aesthetics with a radical politics, and of conflating the aesthetic with the political. Yet it is not that the aesthetic is fundamentally disjoined from the political. A radical aesthetics may in fact mask and even promote the reaction in politics. Architectural culture will always be susceptible to a reaction in politics, not despite its facade of radicalism, but precisely because of it. A facade that is no more than a facade of aesthetic radicalism. End quote. My experience with innovative architectural practitioners has also tempered my initial response to Elizabeth Gross's Architecture from the Outside, in which she queries, quote, how to think architecture beyond complementarity and binarization, beyond subjectivity and signification. It is a question that cannot and should not be answered, but must be continually posed, unquote. The 10 essays comprising her book, written between 1994 and 2000, and subsequently revised for publication, pose a number of questions and sometimes variations on questions. The questions are repeated in a number of ways without offering much in the way of proposals. It may simply be indicative that non-architects engaging with innovative practice become all excited only to find themselves revisiting the same tantalizing possibilities. This was the long-term framing of my approach to innovative architectures. So, just how can the writing and reading of poetry be extended and developed specifically through new discoveries in architecture? One possibility to consider would be the 3 smart screen projects of Decker Yaden involving thermo-responsive surfaces for exterior and interior walls and windows of buildings. To regulate a building's interior temperature through their, quote, shape memory actuators only require changes in temperature to change shape. They open and close to regulate a building's interior temperature. I propose that this offers a new potential for experiencing poems. If it is possible to layer or embed text and images into such a changing surface, or even a series of texts, then it might be possible to live in an optional poetic environment, both potentially permanent and yet simultaneously ephemeral. If the smart screen poem responds to thermal response, can it also respond, manifest, in terms of degrees of light as well? I.e., is it possible to combine photosensitive and thermal sensitive materials? The impulse to combine one form into another structure is certainly not new. I'm thinking of the anthropomorphic pillars supporting the roof of the palace at Q2 in Benin, but one striking example, and that's in Architecture Without Architects. For millennia, humans have fabricated coverings to provide shade in conditions of intense sun and heat, many of them canopies of nets, vines, trellises, and all, thus affording shadow play, whereas Bernard Budowski, the author of Architecture Without Architects, writes, quote, distilling the raw sunlight into a sort of optical liqueur, unquote. What the smart screens offer is the potential for nano-implemented poetry. Further to this, mention should be made of a prototype occasioned by the possibility of funding for such a work, which was to have been included in Language to Cover a Wall, Visual Poetry Through Its Changing Media exhibition, which took place at the University of Buffalo from November of 2011 to February of 2012. The exhibition, curated by Stephen Caffrey, Mike Basinski, and myself, involved more than 300 works of visual poetry from the minuscule to large scale, ranging across centuries. Despite a modest budget outline from Decker-Yagan, funding could not be secured. However, they did go so far as to experiment with pigments and were successful in making text visible in a thermally induced context. Then in July 2012, we met the new director of the Birchfield Penny Art Center in Buffalo, New York, Tony Bannon. Initially, it seemed that Archashift and the other maquettes, these are works that Steve and I collaborated on with Jacob West, might see that gallery on a temporary basis, as Bannon had visited the exhibition and was enthusiastic about Archashift and the works that we had collaborated on. This was followed by a studio visit with Assistant Director Scott Propiak, Tony Bannon being unable to attend as planned due to fundraising deadlines. Subsequently, we visited the Art Center to view possible sites for Archashift and maquettes. The Assistant Director was particularly interested in the proposed work of Decker-Yagan for one specific wall facing north, some 12 meters long and approximately 4 meters high, and encouraged us to think big, quote unquote, even asking that extra nano pigment be included for what he saw as a 2-year installation. Many PDF files were sent to him, poem and environment images, texts, and an earlier version of his paper. That same day, I sent a proposal to Decker-Yagan asking if they would be interested in pursuing this project, and they confirmed the following day. Scott Propiak set out a strategy to realize funding once a budget and a poem were in place. And there was a considerable email exchange between all of us reading poem choice. A gestural, visual poem tentatively titled Murmur. Steve's concept, my design, and tech issues. When the Decker-Yagan proposal came in on the 21st of September 2012, we were thrilled. But Scott Propiak announced that the installation budget of $55,000 was exorbitant and indicated that Tony Bannon was of the same opinion. While our exhibition, An Exquisite Corpus, Vectors of Visual Poetry, opened at the Birchfield Penny in December of that same year, our experience of working with those at the Art Center devolved. Despite a productive and surprisingly long meeting with Tony Bannon in January 2013, we concluded that neither he nor Scott Propiak understand sufficiently the innovative nature of the Murmur project, and so do not have the will to help us realize it. So, on the 9th of January, I sent email to Peter and Martina informing them of our misgivings and read the Art Center and its directors. And an alternative site is yet to be found. The work would appear almost as if an earthquake was taking place, and it would be a black wall with red cracks forming just barely discernible murmur. Of course, the play on the French wall. Other decorating concerns include current research on carbon nanotubes that could one day create a building material able to move without motors. This means that windows might be able to open and close independently with no mechanical parts necessary in response to factors such as room temperature. They have also produced an ink made of nanoparticles which makes office paper and even cotton fabric capable of conducting electricity. There's the potential to revolutionize buildings, design, textiles, and medical applications. In a video at their website and also on YouTube, they've demonstrated how they could power an LED bulb with just a strip of the conductive office paper. The aptly named nano ink is a compound made out of carbon nanotubes, deionized water, and a chemical circuit that helps nanotubes disperse in water. This means that one day regular office paper would have the ability to conduct electricity when coated with nano ink. They were working on it as an alternative electrode to silver for another project, but it isn't commercially available as yet. Turning to another definition of architecture by architect Anand Bhatt, quote, "It will be difficult to assume, within the context of defining architecture, that architecture occupies a space similar to language, that it is expressed much in the same way as words, that buildings or works are units that represent an order, rather like a book." This quotation is simultaneously provocative and flawed. To assume is forever dangerous, and language affords as many forms of expression as there are architectures. Consider the difference between normative narrative in English or any other language and a poetry, again in any language, informed by the investigative. Then compare these examples with technical or scientific writing. Some of these might not represent an order, at least not in a customary sense. Then there are the further examples of how language appears in concrete poetry or scores for sound poetry on the page. Perhaps most apt is the noted difficulty of assuming that architecture occupies a space similar to language. A Swedish architect based in London, Kalle Soderman, has written in his essay on poetry and architecture, quote, "The way of the poetic in architecture is similar to, but ultimately different from, narrative. It works by locating and positioning, not merely in physical, but emotional, political, and cultural space. When standing in front of a building of a rich and specific culture, you can sense yourself in relation to the world in which it belongs. When the position given by architecture enables new views that affect what or how you see, there can be poetry. See is used in its widest sense. Understand, find, project, regard, determine, examine, experience, interpret. Written poetry can also be seen as a place created by the poet. You visit this place when reading the poem. The place of the poem is not the environment it describes, but a place from which you can see things you cannot from elsewhere. Every time you visit it, it is the same place, but being a place, you can find new things by looking in a different direction." Unquote. Here the suggestion is that place is what architecture and poetry share, and that written poetry is a specific kind of place for finding new meanings and interpretations. In addition to my hope of exploring the tantalizing possibilities of thermally prompted poetry, there are other more immediate engagements for environment-based works. Steve McCaffrey, Jacob West, and myself are in a stalled process of transforming 3 poems into full-scale installations of varying dimensions. Poems in question are by Steve, and that one is titled Archeshift, myself, Reverse Definitions Manifesto, which actually appears in the yearbook, and Jacob West's untitled work. Only Archeshift exists in a full-scale version. The other 2 are presently in the form of maquettes. From its layered mylar original, West's poem has become a series of large-scale, approximately 1 by 1 meter, mylar screens within an adjustable system intended as a temporary collapsible installation. The panels are to be read individually or as a whole. They can be experienced interchangeably to enact diverse paths, with the overall meaning producing the same conceptual results. Reverse definitions manifestos, mylar ribbons, form an environment of word membranes that create both barriers and pathways of circulation. To further this experience, the membranes can be moved around the site by its occupants as they seek to create new words visible from new angles. These are no longer pages of a poem of a crude meaning, but a tactile, variable encounter. Archeshift is an updated 3-dimensional version of McCaffrey's 1975 Shifters. In a note on shifters in his selected works, 7 pages missing, McCaffrey states, quote, "Shifters include all pronouns and indicators and mark actual instances of discourse. I as an empty sign, a fundamental negativity and potentiality to be filled, occupied, and then abandoned. At the time of composing Shifters, I was convinced of the essentially spatial notion of locutory identity, that I and you marked less an identity than a position, and this led me into examining the numerous topologies of self in writing." Unquote. Upon entering the container's interior, a light turns on to cast a silhouette of the occupant onto the surrounding membrane, signaling to those surrounding that in this present instance, the I manifests as the occupant reads the text referring to I therein. On the exterior, the panel of text refers to you and is best viewed, read, when backlit with light provided by the current occupant, visible as a silhouette, giving the individual the title you. Standing at just over 2 meters, the container resembles an airport security environment, and the text on the interior makes a playfully ominous reference to this aspect by including the phrase, "and I'm loving the sight of your naked body," quote unquote. These are not intended as interdisciplinary exercises, but as a transdisciplinary manifestation. The poems become a time-based enactment of reading and experiencing architecture through poetry, and poetry as an architectural premise. In a different context, Alexander Nagel and Christopher Wood's observation that, quote, "the screen protects, obstructs, and captures, but it also permits a degree of transgression," unquote, makes me suggest that degrees of transgression are a positive aspect in a process towards the transdisciplinary and should be considered further. In The Cook's Tale, part of Steve McCaffrey's reinventing of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, McCaffrey explores another aspect of architecture to poetry. Quote, "The page is the room the poet must get out of. It is the absence of his text to be. In completing the writing, the text too will be absent, beyond him, the absence of his text to him. And so he will never be beyond the page, the absolute room in which doors can only be imagined, windows merely hypothesized." Another approach is evident in English architect Neil Spiller's work since 1998, a combination of surrealist and Dada influences brought into contact with nanotechnology. Spiller is perhaps most infamous for suggesting that architecture can be grown from a client's DNA. In an essay recently posted at Archimorph, he describes his communicating vessels project. Quote, the Communicating Vessels project consists of surrealist tactics, genetic gazebos, harvesting DNA code as planting plants, mixing augmented and actual geographies, and is powered by a biotechnical fluid called the grease, produced by desiring machines, egged on by human interactions. The imperatives of the landscape can seldom be fully described at any one point. Unquote. For those of us, writers and readers, who have come to embrace the notion that no system of meaning can be closed or stable, and that the truth of any one way of taking the world cannot be canonically established, as F.L. Rush wrote in Arakawa and Gibbs, that innovative architectural practice provides strategies beyond reading and writing to the various acts comprising the practice of everyday life and our accompanying perceptions of it. In considering poetry as part of this everyday life and aware that poetry's meaning and practice in contemporary terms will not remain fixed, it is surely the poet's responsibility to encourage evolving ways of poetic activity and perception, to echo Ezra Pound in the epigram. In thinking about language as the primary environment, this thanks to Steve, whose observation and insight I'm indebted to, and the way language interacts, intersects, defines, absorbs, modifies as architecture, is informing my own writerly production. So I'm now considering poetry as almost a particular assemblage of perceptual angles, degrees, and vectors even, in what is the process of creative ideas being constructed through and in relation to language. Hopefully this is what will continue to develop similarly to the writer and reader of innovative poetry, the practitioner and audience of innovative disciplines in their multiplicity of unfolding. And to end, I will quote Frank Lloyd Wright, to whom is attributed this: every great architect is necessarily a great poet. Unquote. For the time being, the architect is given the final say. Thank you.